Buon pomeriggio.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sebastiano, and I'm one of the volunteers of BergamoScienza. Before starting, I ask you to listen to the following. Connecting to bergamoscienza.it and clicking a look at the live session, it's possible to follow via streaming directly on YouTube of BergamoScienza channel, and the conference is also available on Facebook. From both channels, you can send questions to the speakers or invite your friends and followers to follow the conference in streaming. The questions from the web are received by the volunteers here, and we will select them during the debate, during the Q&A session. Conferences of the 23rd edition of BergamoScienza are made accessible to people with motor and sensorial disabilities. We guarantee no architectural barriers, and we also guarantee speech language translation. All conferences are recorded, and some are also sent directly via streaming. Conferences with foreign speakers provide simultaneous translation, and recordings will be published on our official channels at the end of the festival. These services are made available by the Fondazione della Comunità Bergamasca and Fondazione Banca Popolare di Bergamo, which together with BergamoScienza want to promote accessibility and inclusion. For simultaneous translation, you can scan the QR code the volunteers can give you, or the one that you see projected here. The QR code will directly take you to the Converso web app, where you can select the language for simultaneous translation from the drop-down menu. To listen to simultaneous translation, you need headsets. So we ask to use your own if you have. If you don't, please ask the volunteers to give you a pair of headsets. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's event titled The Four Realms of Existence. The speaker will be Joseph LeDoux from New York University. Nicola Quadri will moderate. He's director of the Fondazione BergamoScienza. And Paola Zaratin will introduce this session. She comes from the Italian Foundation for Multiple Sclerosis. We ask you to switch off your mobile phones and thank you for your attention.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti.
Good afternoon, everybody. We wanted to ask you 5 minutes, which we decided to dedicate to Edoardo Boncinelli, who unfortunately died a few months ago. I would ask Alessandra, Andrea, Umberto, and Raffaella to come on stage, and I would ask everybody else to watch this video.
Per noi
Edoardo Boncinelli, for us, was not just a great scientist, but a great friend. A great friend not just of BergamoScienza, but before then a great friend of Synapsis. And especially at the beginning, he was one of the few great scientists, together with Rita Levi-Montalcini, who supported us and wanted to show his face to represent our activity, because he believed in it right from the beginning. he was a monument to science as far as we are concerned, and he's written more than 100 books, so he was also capable of spreading the concept of science. And thanks to his activity here at BergamoScienza and elsewhere, he's been a milestone for everything that then BergamoScienza was capable of giving you these years. His loss obviously made us all really sad. Probably the majority of the people who knew him is sad about his death. And his death is not just a physical loss, because what he has written will remain both for science and for scientific knowledge, where he was one of the masters through his books, because he tried to explain to us what science was in the easiest possible manner. Moreover, he was also a fun person. He was great fun. He was a nice person. He knew how to be ironic, and he had a lot of humor. And his life has been filled with great knowledge. He's always tackled scientific topics in a very simple way, really trying to work to explain to all of us what we're doing and where we're heading to. So I would I don't want to dwell too much on this because he wouldn't have liked that. I would like to thank you, to thank him, to thank Angela and Francesco, as well as Giovanni, his sons. We're close to them. We've always been close to them and to him in particular, and we'll never forget him. Thank you very much, Edoardo. Thanks to you all. Now we ask Mr. LeDoux to start this fantastic lecture. Thank you very much for being with us. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to be here this afternoon with you all. And it's an honor to welcome Professor Joseph LeDoux with just a few introductory remarks. He's an authoritative scholar. He studies the mechanisms of neuroscience, and he teaches at New York University, where he's head of the Emotional Brain Institute. BergamoScienza, in collaboration and with the support of the Italian Association for Multiple Sclerosis, and through its foundation, is honored to host such an important scientist capable of studying the complex mechanisms of the brain, but also capable of talking in a very clear manner about human emotions, humane emotions. Emotions, the instinctive ones, but also the layered ones, the deepest ones, are an integral part of the way in which our brain functions. And today, this afternoon, as head of the scientific research for the Italian Association of Multiple Sclerosis, and also as myself, as Paola, I'm going through a lot of emotions. Some are instantaneous, others are deeply rooted in my background, in my history. I studied neuroscience first at the university, and then in private organizations, and in the last 15 years at the Italian Associations for Multiple Sclerosis. The strongest emotion taught me a fundamental lesson. It's not so much of translating research for people, but it's a question of translating research with the people. And this is the mission that the Italian Association for Multiple Sclerosis has been following throughout these years. If we want effective neuroscientific research, a type of research that really leads to practical results, we need to start with the experience coming from the community. We talk about community-based neuroscience, a neuroscience which is actually based on the community. It's only by listening about the experience of people who experience the impact of neurological diseases, only by listening to civil society, to you all who are here today, is it possible to move towards a transformative type of science, a science that will certainly have an impact on all of us, a type of science that will change things for all of us. Suffices to think about the challenges ahead of us, for example, neurotechnological ones, including, for instance, artificial intelligence, which is based on numbers rather than emotions. And so, to promote a responsible innovation, we need to listen to the community. We need to listen to people, to their emotions, to their feelings. And in fact, today we talk about hybrid intelligence, an intelligence that associates artificial intelligence with humane ones, that empowers the artificial one with that of human beings. To build up this future, the Italian Association of Multiple Sclerosis and its foundations has promoted institutional changes which are very important at national as well as international level, not just to deal with what neuroscience must study, but also on how that must be done. We need research which is participative and responsible. And the multi-actor model we have developed with people with multiple sclerosis, i.e. to win, we need to act together, is a model that started from multiple sclerosis, but that can be extended to very many other initiatives. And it's the one we are currently using in various international activities. One of these initiatives led to a very important result. It allowed us, collaborating with 5,000 people all over the world, it allowed us to discover that cognitive aspects, those of memory, those of attention, those that are involved in the processing of information, are those which count the most for young people with multiple sclerosis. So young people with multiple sclerosis are transforming the way in which we study neuroscience and we develop research on multiple sclerosis, like all people who actually have to live with this type of disease. This is the type of research we want, the one we believe in, and the one we want to develop with the support of the scientific, international, as well as national communities. That's why I am particularly honored to welcome Professor Joseph LeDoux, who will provide us with a lecture on a very important topic, such as the 4 realms of existence. I now leave the floor to Nicola Quadri to introduce Professor LeDoux, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Grazie. Grazie Paola Zaratin.
Thank you, Paola Zaratin, and thanks again for the support
Anche AISM in prima persona fa.
The Foundation and the Association are working on. I'll just steal a few more minutes before leaving the floor to Professor LeDoux and to his lecture. We've already provided you with some information. He's Professor Emeritus at New York University. He's been Director of the Emotional Brain Institute and is also Vice Director of Max Planck for Language, Music and Emotions. I believe that the most interesting things I wanted to say, maybe Professor LeDoux will hint at those too, is that Mr. LeDoux, as many scientists, is a person who has lots and lots of interests. First, because when he started his career, he started studying psychology and marketing, so probably without really thinking that he would have become one of the most important scientists studying emotions, the function of emotions, and the relationship within the body and the brain. But then he was struck along this path and developed a PhD in psychobiology, and since then he started an extraordinary career that made him become a reference point in the study of emotions, of memory, of conscience, of the neural basis of these functions, and of how they communicate. Professor LeDoux is also a musician, is a songwriter. He plays a guitar. The Amygdaloids is his band, taking the name from the amygdala because Professor LeDoux has dealt with anxiety, with fear, with the neural substrates that are connected with the amygdala. I don't think we are surprised by the fact that Mr. LeDoux is coming here to talk about consciousness tonight. Because we're here to try and understand how, after he's dedicated his life to these topics, what the subjective experience is, why we have a narration of ourselves, why each of us here in this room lives the world, experiences the world as though it was, a theatrical spectacle. This is obviously a very complex topic and also mysterious to a certain extent. And then Professor LeDoux will tell us to which extent and if so. But we shouldn't be struck because, in fact, fear is one of those functions that crosses all levels. It's present in nature. It's necessary to react to threats. And so it is present in organisms that have different levels of complexity and starts from an extremely physical and physiological response, which we're all aware of. And I think we all experienced it, and then gets to the narration of this fear, the ideas we have about our stories and of our fears. And this huge difference between biology, the body, and the narrative is one of the big mysteries we still have. And the fact that it exists is also the reason why also in anxiety and fear we know that different things come into play, such as drugs, molecules that help us when we suffer of anxiety, from anxiety, and that help us fight this condition, especially if it makes us suffer, but also psychotherapy, so the dialogue and how these two things that are so different can work together is something, and is one of the reasons for this mysterious and fascinating connection Professor LeDoux is going to talk about tonight. I leave the floor to Professor LeDoux, whom I'd like to thank very much once again for being here with us today. To you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and see so many friends and meet new friends. Today I'm going to be talking about life and what we know about life and what we can learn about life, because that's one of the most important things to all of us. Let's just get through this quickly. So, life is a very complicated thing, and my approach to it has been to try to follow the trajectory of life in this new book that I've written. But before I describe the book to you, I want to talk to you about something I did in the late 1970s, which was studying split-brain patients with Michael Gazzaniga for my PhD. And we had one particular patient in particular that we found a very interesting phenomenon in. Now, in a split-brain patient, that's a person in whom the two hemispheres have been separated to control the spread of seizures between the two sides of the brain. So when you do this, the left side of the brain can only see, the left side of the screen can only be seen by the right hemisphere, and the right side of the screen only by the left hemisphere. So when the patient is observing this picture, then the left hand points to a shovel, and the right hand points to a chicken. The left hemisphere, what did it see? Well, let's hear what he has to say about why he pointed to what he pointed to. He said, "I saw a chicken claw, and so I picked a chicken." So this is the left hemisphere speaking. The right hemisphere doesn't speak. The left hemisphere speaks. "I saw a chicken claw, so I pointed to a chicken." And then he said, "You need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed." But the left hemisphere did not see anything about a shovel. All it saw was the right hemisphere saw the snow scene, and the left hemisphere told a story, made up a narrative to explain why the left hemisphere, was pointing to the shovel. The left hemisphere saw nothing about the snow scene. So he just took the fact that there was a chicken and a shovel and made that into a story about why he did what he did. Now, that's something we do all the time. Every day of our lives, we encounter situations, we act, and then we explain why we acted. And that is a common, very common phenomena of human existence. This led us to the hypothesis that when we observe our body responding non-consciously, it results in cognitive dissonance. Given that we have so many non-conscious or unconscious systems in our brain that are producing our behavior all the time, we have to we have to do something to accommodate all of this dissonance that we're experiencing. Now, we all believe we have free will, regardless of what scientists tell us. Free will is a very kind of something we're all intimate with. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not that free will exists. It's something that we all believe and can follow and understand. So if we are an organism with free will, then it's very discomforting to see that we have performed a behavior that we did not intentionally charge ourselves to do. So this is the idea of these unconscious systems controlling our behavior. Now, almost everything we do unconsciously. I'm talking to you without I'm not looking at my slides here or anything. I'm just talking off the top of my head. I'm not planning a word I'm saying. It's just coming out because I know what I want to say. And it's all coming out unconsciously without me planning any of the words that are coming. I have a general idea of what I'm talking to you about, but not the specifics. It's just all in there unconsciously waiting to come out. And that's true, again, of almost all our behavior. We interact with people unconsciously. And only when something disrupts the take and go between two people, only if it's disrupted does the conscious mind come into play. Now, again, this was all from 1978, 1979, that time. And I've been thinking about this my entire scientific career and trying to understand what was going on in the brain that causes it to generate these narratives. So I wrote many books over the years. Let me just jump to this here. But after I did the study, I turned to studies of rats. And the reason I did that was because there were no good methods for studying the human brain, and I wanted to study emotion. So I turned to rats, and I did a lot of research on how the part of the brain called the amygdala controls emotional behavior. And my work on the amygdala and emotional behavior led to a lot of discussions about the amygdala being the brain's fear center. And that is something I had to renounce later in my career, and I'll mention that later. I just want to tell you that I spent most of my scientific career studying emotions in rats, emotional behavior in rats, but what I was always thinking about in the back of my head was how did that experiment and that patient, what was the meaning of that experiment? So this is when I wrote this book in 2003. It was right during the pandemic, so it's my pandemic book. Started the book in 2003. It's called The Four Realms of Existence. And in this book, I try to come to resolution with all of the aspects of my entire scientific career and put them into four categories. So I'm going to read a little bit from the book at the beginning because there's a lot of information that sets the whole problem up here. Many of us understand that the mental aspect of who we are is embedded in the part of the body known as the brain, and therefore is also part of our physical bodily existence. Still, even true believers of the physical nature of the mind sometimes feel as though as though it has processes or some quality or qualities that are lacking in other physical systems within our brain and even within our body and even within our brain. Now, we have firsthand knowledge of the mental states that we refer to as our perceptions, memories, thoughts, and emotions, but we lack awareness of processes in the brain that control our digestion, respiration, heart rhythm, and much of our behavior. What is it about the mental stuff that makes it seem different from the rest of the physical stuff in our brain that constitutes what and who we are? What and who we are is what we're talking about today, what it is to be a human being. Just as your mind depends on your brain being part of your body depends on the life-sustaining functions of other components of your body. If your heart stops beating or your lungs collapse, all of your other organs, including your brain, will soon cease to function in a way that is compatible with life. Without life, without bodily life, there is no brain function, and without brain function, no mind. How then, out of all of this biological physicality, do we each come to exist as a being that knows it was born in the past, exists in the present, and will someday die? The standard approach to such questions about individuality is to focus on psychological notions like self or personality. These have long guided philosophical musings, as well as scientific theories and research about what it is to be a human being. But there is little agreement about what self and personality refer to, and even whether they refer to real entities as opposed to just being shorthand labels for a variety of psychologically interesting phenomena. David Hume long ago called the self the elusive I. He was a famous philosopher in the 17th century. Sean Gallagher, a present-day philosopher, said, despite the comfort level of the field to talk about the self, what is said is usually controversial. Daniel Dennett, the late Daniel Dennett, the great philosopher, said, the self is an illusion. Harry Stack Sullivan, a Freudian psychologist or post-Freudian psychologist in the middle of the 20th century, said personality is an illusion. Walter Mischel, a personality psychologist, said personality is a myth. Owen Flanagan, another philosopher of current times, said just because the self is in our vocabulary does not mean that it has any explanatory value. And Thomas Metzinger, a German philosopher, said nobody ever had or was a self. Now, my summary of all of this is yourself is not a thing. It's a story you tell yourself about who you are, who you tell yourself and others about who you are. And this takes us back to the split-brain patient and the story he told himself about what he was doing. Scientific discoveries over the last several decades from diverse fields such as neuroscience, genetics, artificial intelligence have led to new ideas about human beings exist as physical systems. These findings and challenging cherished assumptions about human nature have resulted in an epistemological vacuum. In no small part, this is because thinking about who and what we are has not advanced significantly beyond traditional ideas, some put forth in ancient times by Aristotle and Plato and other philosophers back then. The various phenomena that have been discovered while studying self and personality have, without question, provided important insights into human nature. It's not that the data are wrong, it may be that the scientific explanation is wrong. So what if our scientific understanding of what and who we are is confused? Specifically, what if our constructs are inadequate as conceptual hooks on which to hang all of these data, all of the empirical findings that have been discussed in the name of these constructs, self and personality? Because these centuries-old notions obscure as much as they reveal, the phenomena might be better served by a new conceptual home, one grounded in contemporary scientific conceptions and in empirical laboratory research. So let's get started. A human being can be characterized as a composite of four fundamental, parallel, entwined realms of existence that reflect our evolutionary past and account for our present ways of being. The four realms are, first of all, biological, neurobiological, cognitive, and conscious. All four deep down are biological, but the neurobiological transcends the mere biological realm, and the cognitive realm transcends the mere neurobiological realm, and the conscious realm transcends the mere cognitive realm. They coalesce as an ensemble of being. And together, the four realms and the resulting ensemble amount to account for what and who we are, including those aspects of us that fall under the rubrics self and personality. Now, one way to think about this is in terms of reduction from higher to lower levels, starting with higher order organization and going all the way down to the physics to the particles that physicists have discovered. But that's not what I'm talking about here at all. What I'm talking about instead is how symbiotic interactions between the levels sustain the organism. You see that the biological existence is necessary for life, and it's the lowest level, but it interacts and enables the neurobiological level. But at the same time, you see an arrow going back from the neurobiological level to enable the biological level to be more effective. So keep that in mind as we go forward here. So here we have the four realms. Each realm anatomically permeates and physiologically enables the level above it. And at the same time, the survival potential of the level below is enhanced by the one above. The realms somewhat resemble the components of a Russian doll, but unlike a Russian doll in which the parts simply stack on top of one another, our component realms are integrated, conjoined, and interdependent. Everything about an individual human being, biologically and psychologically, is subsumed within the entwined, nested, hierarchical organization of our realms of existence. So again, let me just point out that biological existence existed fine before neurobiological existence occurred. Only animals have nervous systems, so only animals have a neurobiological existence. But having a neurobiological existence allows animals to transform what the biological realm can do, because it enables the organism to be able to act in various ways to achieve its goals that you cannot do if you don't have a neurological system, a neurobiological system. So here we are. We've got the biological realm, which is about body physiology. This occurs in all organisms that ever lived from the earliest bacterial cell 4 billion years ago to present time. Neural control is what the neurobiological realm does, and it exists in all animals. Mental modeling is what the cognitive realm does. Mental modeling is the creation of an internal model of the world. Today you were coming to a lecture, so you have an internal representation of what you were coming to. You may know something about me because maybe that's why you're here. So you would have a kind of internal map of me as well. You may have read some of my books, so you might know about the kinds of things I'll talk about, and so forth. So these mental models create understanding for you so that in a situation you don't have to unpack everything in the moment. It is already packed together and unpacked for you as you go through the experience you're having in the moment. So mental modeling, though, is only present in some animals. And when we get to subjective experience, consciousness, that too is only present in some animals. Now, there are great debates about which animals are cognitive in consciousness. My goal here is not to tell you which animals are cognitive or conscious. My goal is to tell you what I understand about human cognition and human consciousness. So that will be the main focus of the topic here. There'll be a little bit about other mammals as we go along, though. So the biological realm, its main factors, its main functions are to allow individual survival through metabolism. All of the metabolic processes in your body keep you alive, and without those, you die. And we also have replication. That is the ability for the species to survive. So metabolism and replication are the key factors in a very brief summary form of life and biology, but those are two of the main factors that are involved. So these entwined realms of existence can be viewed in light of evolution. So the big point here is that old features in evolution change less than new ones as a new species arrives. So this was a point that was made by the biologist Louis Buss a number of decades ago. He said, new organisms not only possess novel features, otherwise it wouldn't be a new organism if it didn't have novel features compared to the ancestor that it evolved from. Not only do they possess novel features, but they retain features of the group that they diverge from. New or newly changed features then become the primary target of natural selection going forward. The basic life-sustaining physiological functions like metabolism have been repeatedly tested for their survival value and tend to change relatively little in the evolution of new species. More often, change involves new processes that control the organism's particular kind of body and the way it interacts with its environment in supporting metabolism and sustaining life. The new things tend to often be things that have to do with our sensory systems and our motor systems that allow us to behave in novel ways. Okay, the neurobiological realm. So the neurobiological realm depends on having a nervous system. And it's commonly understood that we have a peripheral nervous system that has nerves that control body tissues, and a central nervous system that is in charge of the nerves that control the body tissues. So this is pretty much dogma in neuroscience, but in the middle of the 20th century, Alfred Sherwood Romer, a comparative anatomist, had this to say. He had an idea about a different way of thinking about the nervous system. He wrote about this twice, one in 1958, and then he republished it in 1972. I guess people weren't listening, so he came back to it a few decades later. In many regards, the vertebrate organism, we are vertebrates like fish and mammals and reptiles and birds and so forth. In many regards, the vertebrate organism, whether fish or mammal, is a well-knit structure. But in other respects, there seem to be a somewhat imperfect welding, functionally and structurally, of distinct beings. So one of these beings inside the person or animal is an external somatic animal, including much of the flesh and bone of the body, and also the sensory systems, that's part of the somatic, and an internal visceral animal, basically consisting of the digestive system and its appendages, the digestive tract and its appendages, which to a considerable degree conducts its own affairs and over which the somatic animal exerts incomplete control. So we have this somatic animal, sensory and motor ability to perceive the world, to act in it, and we have an internal animal inside us that keeps us alive through metabolism and so forth. So metabolism and these somatic sensories, or somatic and visceral capacities, are two important kinds of realms that I'm talking about in terms of the four realms of existence. But I go much further than Sherwood did with this. So again, here's the traditional view. You have a nervous system that consists of a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system has somatic and visceral components in it, and the peripheral nervous system has somatic and visceral components as well. It's as if the central and peripheral nervous system is the top of the hierarchy in the nervous system. But Sherwood said, no. What's the top of the hierarchy is whether it's a somatic nervous system or a visceral nervous system, and having a central and peripheral component is secondary to having a somatic. And the way he came to that conclusion is by analyzing ancient animals. For example, unicellular protozoa, things like, to get in your gut and so forth. They have a somatic body encased in a cell membrane. They're only one cell, but they're encased in a cell membrane that is able to interact with the outside world. So that is the somatic part of their body. But inside their body are their visceral functions that keep metabolism going. So unicellular protozoa have no nervous system, but they have a visceral and somatic existence. That's why we have to flip this thing around, because when we get animals, the first animals, early animals, are the first to have a nervous system. They have no central nervous system. They only have a peripheral nervous system. And not until later animals, like animals, for example, do you have both a visceral and a somatic nervous system and a central and peripheral component of that. So the visceral and somatic are the highest level evolutionarily, and therefore we have to respect that as we try to understand our bodies and the bodies of other vertebrate animals. So just to summarize that, through natural selection, the visceral and somatic functions of the body of unicellular protozoan ancestors were carried forward in early animals and their peripheral nervous system. And then, when more complex animals arrived, a central nervous system was added on. So the central nervous system is not the top part of the hierarchy. It's in the middle. Central and peripheral are in the middle of the hierarchy. So what is the function of the neurobiological realm? So neurobiological realm responses are automatic neural activities elicited by sensory stimuli that are innate or learned. So for example, some examples of this, of sensory motor integration in relation to reflexes. So reflexes are automatic. You step on something hot, you lift your leg and so forth. Motor programs, we have these innate motor programs that allow us to perform certain necessary components of movement. We have instincts, or what the ethologists called fixed action patterns. These would be innate behaviors that are passed on from generation to generation within a species. For example, many animals, when in danger, will freeze to the dangerous stimulus. And so in humans and rats, for example, we often find ourselves freezing in the presence of a dangerous stimulus. That is not because fear has caused us to freeze. That is because freezing is an instinct to a particular kind of stimulus, a dangerous stimulus. Now, you can condition freezing with Pavlovian conditioning to connect it to learned stimuli as opposed to instinctual stimuli. And you can perform stimulus response habits as well. Now, habit learning is a particular kind of higher level kind of learning, but it is particularly independent of its goal. It's a non-goal directed activity, and we'll talk about that later. But these are things that are, in other words, elicited automatically without any cognitive control. Now, here are some key underlying connections that are associated with Pavlovian conditioned freezing and visceral responses. Because when you're freezing, you're having a lot of visceral responses. This is a diagram I just created long ago, long before I knew about Romer's whole idea. But little known to me that I had duplicated Romer's idea involving the amygdala and Pavlovian fear conditioning. For example, a conditioned stimulus goes into sensory processing systems, reaches the amygdala. The amygdala has a channel that goes to the somatic nervous system in the lower brainstem that ultimately controls the skeletal muscles like freezing or flight. But it also has an output to the hypothalamus and other visceral circuits in the central nervous system that then connect through the peripheral nervous system to control heart rate, sweating, hormones, and other visceral functions. So I really am a true believer of Romer's position here. But what I want to say is that even though these circuits belong to even though these circuits are often talked about in terms of the amygdala and fear, they are not responsible for fear. They are things that happen independent of the conscious experience of fear. So we have to get to that now. Before I go to the cognitive realm, I want to describe the evolution of something called goal-directed learning. Right now we're looking at the basal ganglia of a reptile. So reptiles are very good at learning stimulus-response habits. For example, you see there's a stimulus, for example, the sight of food. Under the stimulus is the reinforcer, the taste of food. So the stimulus goes to sensory cortex, and sensory cortex sends it to the basal ganglia. Sensory cortex goes to motor cortex and sends the signal to the basal ganglia. And the reinforcer goes to the basal ganglia and puts the sensory and motor connection together. It reinforces the sensation and the action as a unified condition now. So whenever the organism sees the stimulus, it no longer has to be reinforced because the stimulus response habit has been established. So the animal sees the stimulus and then it approaches the food, or it sees something dangerous and it avoids that thing and stays away from it. So this is the reptilian way of learning. But we're going to put that aside now and turn to the cognitive realm. It's relatively easy to separate biological beings from non-living matter. If something is alive, it is a biological being. Deciding which biological beings exist neurobiologically is also relatively straightforward. If an organism has a nervous system, it is a neurobiological being, and by definition, it exists neurobiologically. So that narrows things down to animals, or at least most animals, in terms of cognition. So when it comes to cognition, things are considerably more complex because there are no physical properties that can be called upon to decide which animals exist cognitively. The workings of the cognitive mode of existence must be inferred from other properties, most typically from behavior. And that can be tricky because different scientists have different defined cognition differently. So my definition of cognition is a pretty traditional one. I don't think it's controversial at all. The capacity to construct mental models of the world and to use these in thinking, planning, deciding, acting, and feeling. So this is, again, the basal ganglia of a reptile. Eric Kandel, the great neuroscientist who received the Nobel Prize for his groundbreaking work on learning and memory, had this to say: the evolution of novel behavioral circuits often involves small changes in existing circuits. That's exactly the point that Buss had made. I don't know if Kandel knew about Buss or not, but it's the same point, and it's a very important point. So in order for mammals to be able to have goal-directed behavior as opposed to just habitual behavior, what they simply did, what evolution did, was simply modify the habit system of reptiles. So that's what we have here. In the blue, you see the habit system of reptiles there, but mammals also have other things. They have a new kind of cortex in which they can do different kinds of learning with. So if you see the sensory motor cortex is all that reptiles have in the blue, with mammals you have something called prelimbic cortex, which can create mental models, and you have an orbital frontal cortex and an insular cortex, which can process reinforcers and so forth from the outside world. And so you're able to put these two things together into a kind of representation of what's good and bad, and in the future to make decisions about how good and how bad, because even things that are bad sometimes we allow ourselves to partake of. So there's a lot that went on in the transition from reptiles to mammals. I'm not going to go through all this detail here. Finally, we get to the conscious realm. So is conscious a scientific mystery? Many philosophers tell us it is. And it is in the sense that the mechanisms underlying biological inheritance or bacterial infections were mysterious before they were figured out. If it's not physical, then it's not a scientific problem. If it is physical, it's a scientific problem that can be solved, or potentially be solved. The scientific pursuit of what it's like to be conscious should not be limited by philosophical concerns that such feelings are too hard for science. Because philosophers have this notion of qualia, the idea of what it feels like to have an experience, conscious experience. And if some of them have made qualia non-physical elements. For example, David Chalmers, a leading philosopher of mind, is a dualist. This is not dualism in the kind of sense of religion, but it's a philosophical dualism, which means it's non-physical. So he has qualia as non-physical and has led many scientists to start looking for qualia, ignoring the fact that it's non-physical. So if you make qualia to be physical, you're making them to be non-scientific and setting up the scientific problem in a way that can only lead to failure. William James had a very good statement about something like this. He said, "Our reasonings have not established the non-existence of the soul. They've only proved its superfluity for scientific purposes." We could say the same thing about qualia. Their superfluity in terms of scientific purposes. So here's some scientific notions of consciousness. One is creature consciousness, the condition of being alive, awake, and behaviorally responsive to environmental stimuli. This exists in all animals. If it's alive and awake, it has creature consciousness. So it's a very, very broad definition. But what we're more interested in is mental state consciousness, which is the capacity to experience the world and one's relationship to it. This only exists in some animals. And what I want to talk about is the human animal. Now, research and theories about mental state consciousness often focus on two parts of the brain and two kinds of states of the brain. One is visual consciousness, which involves the visual cortex, and the other is mental state consciousness, which is said to involve the lateral prefrontal cortex. So the visual cortex in the back of your head, lateral prefrontal in the front of your head. And lateral prefrontal cortex is a unique primate invention. And in humans, there's a special part of it that extends all the way into the front of the lateral prefrontal cortex that only humans have. So that's just a note to keep in mind. So there are lots of different theories of consciousness, but I'm going to talk about two kinds here. One is first-order theories that propose that lower-order representations in visual cortex are sufficient to be aware of what you're seeing. Like what you're seeing on the screen, all you need is visual cortex. And higher-order theories propose that first-order states have to be cognitively re-represented or re-described in order to be experienced. This is out of place, I'm going to skip that. So a focus on visual cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is not sufficient. Consciousness research could use a kind of upgrade, a neuroanatomical upgrade here. In real life, as opposed to psychophysics labs, a lot of these consciousness studies go on in academic psychology departments or neuroscience departments, where a dot of light is flashed on the screen and the person has to acknowledge whether they saw the light or not. But that is a very rudimentary view of consciousness. Consciousness is the the beauty of the world, the love you have for your friends, and the hate you have for other people, the pleasure you receive from a good meal. It's much more complex than the dot of light on the screen. And also, the prefrontal cortex circuitry is far more complex, and its inputs are much more diverse than is typically acknowledged in the consciousness field. So a lot of my training is in neuroanatomy before I became a full-fledged psychologist. And so that's why I emphasize so much the importance of understanding the neuroanatomy involved. So this is the typical view in a higher order theory. So I'm not saying higher order theory is great, because I think it has problems too. This is not enough. You can't just send a visual signal to lateral prefrontal cortex and all of a sudden it's going to be experienced. You know, a visual stimulus by itself is meaningless. Only when you combine it with memory does it become a perception, and only once it's a perception can it become a conception and an actual experience. So these are some of the various areas that, instead of asking about the information flow from sensory cortex to lateral prefrontal cortex, I want to talk about the full range of inputs that go to this lateral prefrontal cortex. So, of course, the sensory areas, like visual cortex, auditory cortex, somatosensory cortex, they all go there. That's fine. But again, without memory, they don't mean much. They're very abstract and not they lack meaning. Whereas you also, at the same time, these areas also, the memory areas also go to lateral prefrontal cortex. So the medial temporal lobe, the temporal pole, superior temporal sulcus, parieto occipital junction. So lots of medial, lots of cortical areas involved in memory add to that intersection there. So sensory and memory are coming together there. That's just one place they come together. But in addition, the lateral prefrontal cortex is getting inputs from other areas of prefrontal cortex, like the orbital, ventromedial, anterior cingulate, dorsomedial, and the frontal pole. So there's a lot of information that is going there. All of those areas, by the way, are also getting inputs. All these other prefrontal areas are getting inputs from the memory areas as well. Not so much the sensory areas, but from the memory areas. So that is a much more complex and, to me, reasonable kind of architecture out of which we might begin to look for consciousness, because the other two simple visual cortex and prefrontal cortex are not enough to explain the full beauty of consciousness. So this multi-state I call this a multi-state hierarchical perspective. It replaces the traditional volley between sensory cortex and lateral prefrontal cortex with a more complex anatomical arrangement consisting of a hierarchy of structures, each of which creates different kinds of states that are re-represented or re-described by circuits of PFC, and that contribute to higher order mental modeling and consciousness. So, how much time how much time do I have?
I think 5 minutes, not very much more.
Okay.
So that we will have time for questions.
So, this is the kind of chart of what I was just telling you about. You have sensory cortex. It's going to interact with memory cortex. Sensory cortex and memory cortex are going to interact with higher order cortex, in other words, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Sensory is also interacting with the medial prefrontal cortex, which is older, present in all mammals, whereas the higher order prefrontal cortex is present only in primates. So all of this stuff, the details are not important. The important is there's a hierarchy of information processing that allows things to come together in a way that could account for consciousness. So I'm going to skip this one and just tell you about this one. So Now we're back to my split brain patient and why and how he did what he did when he saw he was producing a behavior. So what I have here is a dual mental model, but let's focus on mental model 1 at the bottom. It's non-conscious. Just, as I tell you, I'm speaking to you and I'm talking without planning what I'm saying. That's non-conscious information processing. So the mental model generates what's called a mental ease narrative. That's an amodal narrative. It has no content at all. It has no abstract code in it. Sorry, it has no particular code in it. So it can take all of these things on the right, sensory, memory, language, goal value, homeostatic functions, all of those kinds of inputs can be put into that amodal narrative that allow you to talk about it, to act on it, and it also allows you to be conscious of it. And that's where the ring going up to the second mental model is. That is the tributary of consciousness. So it allows you to be conscious of the things that you are acting on goal-directedly and talking about or writing about. So that mental model then also feeds back to the first mental model and allows you to be conscious of what you were just conscious of. I know that's a lot to swallow, but this is a way that allows us to understand how it is that we can be talking to each other without being conscious, and how once we become conscious, that allows us some benefits. For example, once we're conscious, we can volitionally, in my view, we can have volitional speech and writing and volitional goal-directed behavior. In other words, a kind of free will kind of thing. Even if it's not true, it's something we believe. And so this is a way that what we believe is being imagined by the brain. The question of whether we actually make conscious choices is a matter of debate, with some arguing that our sense of choosing is illusory. But even with free will, we can sometimes wrongly attribute conscious control to our behavior. For example, this would happen when the conscious mental model notices responses that it did not control and then generates a rationalization to explain the behavior. Again, the split brain finding is why I've been talking to you all afternoon like this. If I'm correct that non-conscious and conscious mental models separately control our behavior and verbal expression, the effort to scientifically understand consciousness may be even more complicated than we thought, since it would mean that we would not know in a given moment which mental model is in charge of what is being reported. In other words, is the non-conscious mental model talking, or is the conscious mental model talking? How is a scientist to possibly know that? Well, when I first wrote this paragraph, I would say, but if we knew the problem better, we could then search for a solution that makes it a feature of consciousness rather than an impediment. But I gave this lecture at Yale, and a very brilliant student afterwards, graduate student, wrote to me and suggested a way to actually assess this. She said, one possibility is the difference between verbal reports controlled by the two mental models lies not just in the superficial words, that is what people say, but in the relation between these words, how people move from one idea to another. This is a process known as semantic progression. The more implicit, spontaneously constructed verbal reports that arise from the preconscious state, the non-conscious mental model, may involve more jumping around from idea to idea, compared to a more intentionally constructed report arising from the conscious mental model. Semantic progression has been measured through existing natural language processing models like latent semantic analysis or unsupervised embedders that compute the semantic similarity between words or sentences. That is, words in the same paragraph should show greater semantic similarity than words across different paragraphs. Indeed, these types of analyses have been used to explore the progression of ideas in narrative text and in film, and may be leveraged to distinguish reports based on preconscious versus conscious states of mind. Now, I don't think, I'm retired now, so I haven't gotten around to doing this, but I'm hoping someone will pick up on this because I think it's a very interesting possibility. So this is my website. If anyone is interested, should have it on here. It's joseph-ledoux.com. You can walk through 3 doors. One is a door as a neuroscientist, one is an author, and the third is as a musician. So this is the book we talked about today, The 4 Realms of Existence. Here are some of my other books, going back to the emotional brain. I think most of these are translated into Italian at the Raffaele Cortino Publishing Company. And this is my new book, just probably not coming out for a year or so, but it's just at the publisher now. And it's a memoir about my life growing up in Cajun country in South Louisiana. It's a French-speaking area of people who navigated there from Nova Scotia when they were kicked out by the British. And the culture remains intact. You've probably heard of Cajun food like gumbo and Cajun music. It's a very interesting subculture of the United States. And of course, I have to mention my band, the Amygdaloids. I can't even spell Amygdaloids, AMYG. We've been together for a long time. We play a lot. We've played a lot in Italy, by the way, at various conferences and stuff. And I'm very happy to come play anytime you want. So thank you very much.
Ringraziamo ancora il professor LeDoux per la bellissima lectio.
I don't hear very well, so if they ask you a question, repeat it to me.
I can tell them to you. Penso che, a parte che ci piacerebbe sicuramente...
Well, apart from the fact that we'd really like to have Professor LeDoux and his band play at BergamoScienza, so you could come back as a musician. If you agree, given that we don't have much time, we can open the Q&A session. So if there are questions from the audience, please raise your hand. There's one here. The mic will be made available. And in the meantime, maybe I also have a couple of questions to ask.
Mi sentite? Grazie per questa interessantissima.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much for this very interesting conference, which I basically totally share. I totally agree with what you just said. And frankly speaking, given my cultural level, I wouldn't even be capable of making any objection. But in everything you told us, there is something that doesn't convince me at all. Why am I skeptical? Well, basically, I always feel as the same person ever since I was born, ever since I became aware of who I was. And even now, I'm 81, and I recognize myself as what I am. But I don't see a distinction between my body or my brain or my emotions, because all these aspects you've talked about are just a unicum that changes all the time. So I don't really know who I am. Am I the one I was 20 years ago, or I am what I am now? Am I thinking about I was thinking 20 years ago, or what I'm thinking about now? So basically, behind all these aspects, there is a reality which I call the soul. What is the soul? Well, the soul, in my opinion, cannot disappear like that. It cannot disappear all of a sudden, and it cannot disappear with death. So in my opinion, it is God that defines everything, because God is present everywhere in all of us. Thank you. Thank you, Dante, for your question, which was a bit complex and also spiritual.
Did you hear the question?
No.
No?
I can tell. So, David Hume, the philosopher, said, how do we know we're the same person today as we were yesterday and younger? And his answer was, because through memory we record over time who we are. Now, we know that memory is not perfect in terms of its ability to record our lives and our experiences, but it gives you the continuity of who you are. Now, I'm not saying that you need to have you feel your different realms, because your realms are integrated and intertwined. They're not simply one versus the other. And when you have a stomach ache, you know you become aware of that one. But most of the time, you have an awareness of yourself as an entirety entity. And I apologize, but I'm not going to talk about religion and so on. Sorry.
Grazie alla risposta. Tra l'altro la
Thank you very much for your answer. And in fact, Dante's question is interesting because in this vision of connections between the body and the mind, it's true that by aging, by getting older, our body changes, hormones change, and sometimes also the personality changes. Because we always say, you know, people don't change, but this is not always true. Obviously, people change, sometimes to the worse, sometimes to the better. But this is something fascinating, anyway, of this vision. Any other question? Any other question? I see one hand raised down there.
Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening. Very briefly, Sigmund Freud, about a century ago, more than a century ago, in fact, has summarized into a sentence the fact that the self is not the master in his home. And he wanted, with this, to summarize everything he had discovered about the unconscious, saying that the majority of the mental activity is not conscious, but rather is unconscious. And his colleagues were shocked by this. And in fact, the bourgeoisie in Vienna were shocked as well. So my question is,
Questo modello del professor LeDoux
your model
rende in qualche maniera conto di questa espressione di Freud?
takes this sentence into account one way or another? This sentence choice said? Thank you.
Did you hear the question?
No.
So the question is, so Freud said that the self is not in charge of your existence, of your experience, referring to the subconscious. So he was asking if how your theory dialogues with the theory of Freud and the subconscious, I think.
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but yes, I mean, I think, you know, Freud's idea that most of our mentation takes place unconsciously is absolutely correct. I'm not necessarily a believer in the deep dark unconscious, but more of the cognitive unconscious. I'm not dismissing the deep dark unconscious. It's just hard for us to know much about that scientifically. But the cognitive unconscious is well understood, and almost all of our cognition and consciousness takes place pre-consciously. The great American neuroscientist Carl Lashley said that every conscious thought is preceded by a non-conscious thought or non-conscious process. So in my model, that would be the conscious thought is preceded by non-conscious cognition, and non-conscious cognition is very active in our brains and minds. And so I think what I'm saying is kind of compatible with what our guest asked, but I'm not sure if I got the whole thing.
Prima di prendere un'altra domanda dal pubblico, io avevo una domanda ed era...
I had a question myself before we get another question from the audience. My question was, are there any technologies and or new approaches which, in your opinion, maybe using new neuroimaging techniques or artificial intelligence or again other tools that will allow us to better understand whether a subject is having a conscious and or an unconscious experience? Are you following this kind of research? Because in the past editions, we had speakers who told us about some of these trials. I'm thinking about Mr. Massimini, who came a few years back and who uses Tononi's theory on consciousness, meant as conscious experience, what makes a person different when he or she is awake or in a coma. Do you trust these new techniques, these new technologies? Do you think some are better than others?
So you're asking about MRI? Are you talking about MRI?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, there's no one that I know will some people I know will say they know what consciousness is, but I think more level-headed people admit that we don't really know. So here's the thing, that I really go by Lashley's point. Every conscious thought is preceded by a non-conscious process, a non-conscious cognitive process. So what I see is that in humans, we have a sense that we cross that line between cognition and consciousness and have our experiences. Now, we can measure cognition in other animals, and so we can see that the things that allow us to have non-conscious cognitive processes are also present in them. But whether they cross the consciousness finishing line is impossible to know, because we don't know what's in another animal's mind. It's hard enough in trying to figure out what's on the human mind, right? So it's a long struggle. Everyone, you know, it's a very popular topic now, consciousness. But it's a really difficult problem, and either you throw it away or you keep trying. And I've been thinking about this since the 1970s, so I'm just going to keep trying.
Grazie. Altre domande?
Are there further questions? Just one, please.
C'è una mano alzata qua davanti.
There is one person here who raised her hand.
Sorry. In italiano, volevo chiedere,
I'd like to ask the following. Recently, given the AI developments, the idea is being developed that instead of replicating an adult intelligence, we should be replicating the intelligence of children who then keep learning and then become adults. So I was wondering if it is true that intelligence and what is related to human intelligence should be studied in children, because they are already there, they have already been formed. So I was wondering if in the study of neuroscience, the scientific research should be carried out on children and not on adults. So is it more meaningful to study children rather than adults?
Well, first of all, I think I'm not a believer in AI and consciousness. It's, you know, the human consciousness evolved over billions and billions of years of biological accidents. And if you were going to replicate that in some machine, you would have to know all of the biological accidents step by step that led to that. Now, I think, and there's often there's often a confusion between artificial intelligence and artificial consciousness. A machine can act intelligently if it's programmed properly, but how it becomes conscious is to me, not even a possibility. So in terms of children, I think there's, of course, a lot of work on children and intelligence, certainly in the U.S. I'm sure there is here as well. So that's not something that's being ignored in science at all.
Grazie.
Thank you.
Visto che c'era l'ultima domanda che
One very last question over here.
L'ultima.
Very last question. I'll be very short. I was wondering whether the cognitive level is more influenced by evolution, is more affected by the species evolution rather than consciousness, because consciousness is more of an individual experience. It is the child who becomes an adult and becomes more aware of its being, but the cognitive factors are carried over, and this carrying over is due to the evolution of the species itself. It's not the evolution of the individual.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't think I have an answer to it. I mean, the cognition and consciousness has to have had evolved. So I wouldn't say that it's just cognition that's evolving, but it's an interesting question. I'll think about that. Thank you.
Un bello stimolo per continuare la ricerca. Ringraziamo ancora
Definitely a stimulus for our research. Thank you, Professor LeDoux, for being with us, and thank you to you all for attending this conference. Thank you, and at 5 p.m. There's going to be a conference on loneliness and social connections, how loneliness can be impactful for your health. Thank you very much. Be with us at 5 p.m. Good afternoon.